All right, well, thank you everybody for coming, especially on this morning. I'm not sure if the mornings like this were the mornings that T.A. Larson was talking about everybody else wanting to be a part of. So my job is to really set the stage. My name is Rob Godby, for those of you who don't know me. I'm at the University of Wyoming. I'm the director for the Center for Energy Economics and Public Policy. A little tiny bit of background of how this came together. There's been kind of discussion, well, obviously since we're all here, about wind development for quite a while and some concerns. And at the same time, I've been working a lot on this. Nicole Corfanta, who you've been introduced to and we'll hear about later. We were thinking about the same things, and that's one of the nice things about being at a university is it's a collaborative environment. We both had the same idea, which is that we really needed to have a conversation about this. We get bogged down in the details, and we thought maybe if we could just step back and really think about what's in front of us and how we want to achieve what we want to achieve. So it's really important to think about, how we do things. And that's what we wanted to have this conference think about. So we spent a lot of time talking about the issues and allowing people a forum to hear and be heard. And for both of those reasons, I'm glad that you came. I'm glad that you braved the weather. And I'm super excited about the conference. Over the next 2 days, what we will do is kind of a mix. So you might be wondering, if you come to a lot of conferences, or many of the conferences I go to, it's a podium and screens and PowerPoint. And then occasionally you go to conferences and you see something like this, and that is very disconcerting because you don't have the prop or the crutch of PowerPoint. It's going to be a conversation today. So what we will do is we will alternate a little bit to give a little bit of background information. We will have PowerPoint presentations, which we will go through this morning, a few basics, and then we will have conversations. And we would really like to focus on those conversations. And that means that there's also an opportunity for the audience to participate. It's not just the people up here that you're here to listen to. We're also here to listen to you. And we hope that this conversation will go on long past when this conference is over, and that this is just the start of thinking about not just this but other issues, and hopefully we can continue to collaborate in this way. So my job up here is to set the stage. As Treasurer Gordon said, energy has a lot of choices. We could go very broad, we could go very narrow. So Jonathan Naughton, who I'll introduce after me, will follow me and talk about some technical issues. And we really had to narrow it down. But the ultimate thing, and we're very blessed this way, is that we've come to a point in time in our history where it's not where will the energy come from, but we actually do have choices. And we all have, there's costs to each energy, we have preferences, and there are also concerns, and we need to think about all those things. We're not just limited to one choice. There's a lot of significant change going on in the energy environment, and so that's a little bit about what I'll talk about, and then I'll bring Jonathan up to talk a little bit more about the specific details, since at the end of the day I'm just an economist, and he's actually an engineer and knows what he's talking about, so I will get out of the way without hopefully doing too much damage. So let me just start by talking about a few disruptive trends, a little bit that you've heard about. Just generally in the energy landscape, there's been a loss of coal mining jobs. We know that now in the state, although they came late to us. And that's been a political issue, and energy is a very political topic. Another topic we've heard a lot about nationally, fracking. And finally, we've heard about renewables. The reason a lot of people are here is because we've had kind of this, quote, explosion of renewables, and there will be more to come. The question is, how do we want to see that happen, really, in the state, and how do we look at those trade-offs? So let me just briefly talk a little bit about employment, that first trend. Something that people are already unaware of. This is on a national basis. These are relatively recent numbers. And since we're focusing, I'm not trying to make this a wind versus coal. In fact, one of the things I'd like to see come out of this conference is that kind of it shouldn't be an either or. And Treasurer Gordon talked about that too. But one thing that you'll notice here is that people are pretty unaware that wind actually creates a lot of jobs in this country. And you can see kind of a ranking there of the types of technology we often use for our power sources and just how they affect people's lives in terms of employment. The other thing you may not be aware of, if you were to go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and look at the occupations that are growing quickest in the country, the occupation that is expected to grow faster, much faster than any other occupation, is wind technician. Wind technicians are expected to grow by 108% in the decade from 2014 to 2024. The next highest, I think, in that list was a 50% rate of growth. They have 25 occupations that they list as, the ones that are expected to grow most quickly. Almost all of those occupations are in the health sector. Very few of them are in manufacturing or producing sector. Also in that is solar, down towards 25. Solar technology and installation is the other. So there is a change going on, and it is going to change how we earn our livings. The other thing, a little bit more change, and the reason I bring up coal is because coal has been kind of the backstop of our energy economy, certainly with respect to electricity. The only thing I can tell you about projections is that they will be wrong. But the point that I'm making here is that this bundle of wires that kind of sticks out there, we don't know which projection is true. There are many others. Most forecasts are for a significant change and for a reduction in coal. Not where we were a few years ago, but potentially where we are now and staying there for quite a while, or potentially dropping. In other words, something is going on that's going to absorb the growth in the economy. So that's what coal looks like. If we look at one of the reasons for this, natural gas production, and this state's been a huge beneficiary of that, has basically doubled over time. But in the past few years, we can see this 40% increase in just basically a decade. And that's obviously the fracking revolution that we hear a lot about. And in fact, it's negatively impacted our state because we were the gas play, and now suddenly the gas plays were elsewhere, and suddenly people were asking, where are our man camps? While the boom was on here, people were wondering when the man camps would leave, and some people were hoping they would, and suddenly they were gone. So change can happen pretty quickly. This technology had been developing for years, but changed the energy landscape very quickly in the United States, especially in the generation sector. And the reason it changed is because in the mid-2000s, gas was at about $7.40, $7.50 if you took an average. Obviously, it peaked at much higher than that, especially during hurricane events. But since then, we've seen gas at half the price. And so coal and natural gas compete against each other. Interestingly, in this state, we don't talk much about that when we're talking about gas versus coal because we benefit from both. But this has really changed the way we make electricity. So this is just that black line at the top is coal, and over time it's typically been at about 50% of our electricity nationwide. What's really important to look at is what's happened in less than a decade. That tailspin kind of down. The yellow line coming up from the bundle of wires below is natural gas. So right now, both sources generate about the same amount of electricity nationally, and these are the most recent numbers available from June. So in June, coal is actually ahead of natural gas, which is a first for about the past 18 months. But this is going to continue. What we're looking at now is probably a trend where those shares stay about the same. What's important to look at in this picture, and it's hard to see right away, is that little green line at the bottom that didn't do anything for years and years and suddenly has started to rise relatively quickly and distinguish itself from those other lines down there, hydro and this nebulous other. Nuclear has been rather stable, but what does this all say? That blue line and the green line are now equal. That's hydro, which are kind of traditional renewable, and the new renewables, which are wind and others. They power about 18% of the grid as of June. If you combine that with nuclear, an amazing fact is almost 40% of our electricity now comes from carbon-free sources, which is to many people, that's an amazing fact. We just used to think of our electricity sector as so carbon intensive, but it's changing very quickly. The other thing I'll mention about that green line is it's going to continue to climb. A year ago it was at 5%, it's now at 9%, and this is the kind of growth we've seen in the renewables. You just see that continuous upward trend. Blue is wind, and we're now beginning to see solar also begin to dig in. That's the yellow underneath. And the combination of those two things over the next decade is going to make a significant change in how we produce electricity. So those are just a few of the trends that I will talk about broadly. And here we're going to talk more about wind in this conference, but there are a lot of decisions to be made. So we have an opportunity in front of us. And whenever you're looking at a wind resource, if I'm teaching an economics class and I'm talking about really any type of opportunity, especially a business opportunity, if we're talking about a resource that we're going to use, do you have a good wind resource? Clearly in Wyoming, we do. We're reminded of that some days more than others. But it's not enough to just have a good resource. You also have to be able to sell that resource, right? It's not valuable unless you can get it to market. So there's a few issues there that we can talk about. One, obviously, is access, transmission availability, and the issues of transmission. That's been a stumbling block in this state. It's very difficult to develop transmission for lots of reasons. It uses the land, it requires regulatory approval, there are many jurisdictions to go through, and we may hear we will hear more about that over the next 2 days. The other thing is really policy. How are policies driving markets, and how are people making social choices, and how are incentives being used, and how is that changing the market opportunity? A couple examples that get a lot of press are renewable portfolio standards and just a desire to use renewable energy. Many people want to use different forms of energy. We see more and more, say, solar panels on people's roofs. Some people will say, well, that's just silly, it's so expensive to do that. Why would they do that when there's a cheaper opportunity that's already attached to their house, right, through the wire? And I kind of compare that sometimes. I used to have conversations with people who couldn't understand changes that were going on in the transportation sector. This weird car called a Prius came out in the early 2000s. This weird car had batteries and electric motors and a gasoline engine. We all know what this car is. For a long time, it was kind of, you either bought a Prius and you were a weirdo, or you didn't buy a Prius, you bought a normal car and you were the smart person, and it was a very different set of perspectives. Over here, they'd say, why would you do that? It's more expensive. I can buy a small car and get almost the same fuel economy. It'll never pay itself off. On the other side, people were buying Priuses, not expecting them to pay off. They certainly got good mileage, but you paid a big upfront price to get them, especially at the beginning, much more than a comparable car. Why did people pay that extra money? Because they wanted to. They were willing to spend it. And this is something we don't hear a lot about in the energy sector, which is how do consumer preferences really drive this? It's something that's going to happen more as the grid changes. Historically, there hasn't been a lot of room for preferences. There's been one source, one utility, you used it or you didn't have an alternative. As Treasurer Gordon said, we are in a new age where we have choices about energy. It's not about having enough, it's about what you will use. And that's going to continue. The other thing is, when we talk about opportunities, you have to talk about who you're competing against. Who are the other sources of supply? What types of energy are they? What's the cheapest one to sell? That'll depend on where you are. And there are issues of taxation and operation, technology. Some of these things we'll talk about. Capacity factor is a really important one for wind, which all of these things loop back, right? That loops back to resource. Taxation will loop back to market, and so on. So, a little bit about these opportunities. There's going to be 3 trends that I'll talk about. First of all, there's policy, very briefly. Policy began in the 1980s with the deregulation of the electricity sector, which is always, what does that mean? Most people don't really know. But there was one little rule called PURPA that had big effects because it kind of opened the door to alternative technologies coming onto the grid back in the day when you only had a single utility that provided electricity. Since then, we now have markets. There are many places that have a lot more choice. And that leads to the second thing, is now consumer preferences can begin to matter, and people express their concerns, one of them being climate change, and they demand renewables for that reason. The other is obviously this technology development that's enabled this choice. And those three things all kind of come together to kind of define this opportunity. So a little bit about deregulation. We are still in what's called the Western grid. Jonathan will talk a little bit more about how the grid is set up in the US very briefly. But in many parts of the United States now, there are markets. Say California, that's in the Western grid, that's the major one, where electricity producers actually compete to provide electricity. Now the traditional model, back in the day, was you had a place that needed electricity, you had a local utility that built a generator, built the transmission lines to get it to the town, or what we would call technically the load center, and then you used it through a set of distribution lines, the ones that we're all used to seeing. What deregulation did was kind of break that up and allow competition into the production sector and created incentives for new sources to come online. And that really opened the door, because the electricity sector was kind of a sleepy place for a long period of time. It was done one way. You built generators, you provided electricity, it was it was heavily regulated, in part because the history of electricity is that in exchange for avoiding competition, which way back in the day, and we're talking turn of the 20th century, electricity meant that you had a spaghetti bowl of lines going across many places. You had streetcar operators that produced their own electricity. You had apartment blocks that produced their own electricity. You had companies that produced their own electricity. And the bottom line is, nobody ever used their generators very efficiently. The streetcars would run their generators mainly when people needed to get to and from work. The apartment blocks would run their generators when they needed lights in the evening. The company would run maybe only during the day and not be used at night. This was horribly inefficient. Several people, some you heard of, some you haven't, industrialists thought, you know, we could do this better if we had one company that supplied everybody. Of course, that's a monopoly. People get concerned about that. The social decision we made is, in exchange for ensuring that competition doesn't undermine efficiencies that are there, utilities would allow their rates to be regulated. That was the way things were, and there wasn't a lot of change because the utility could decide how the electricity was produced. In the 80s, that began to change with deregulation, and today we're talking about many sources on the grid that really probably wouldn't have been developed with that door being open through deregulation. A little bit about consumer preferences. As I said before, deregulation has allowed people to express their preferences. They do this in two ways. They can choose the power that they use in many places, or they can now choose to opt out. This is a concern many utilities have, right? Is you can actually opt off the grid and do it realistically. When you do that, you leave the grid, and that leaves fewer shoulders to carry the fixed cost of the grid, which may drive up the price, which then makes more people to think about, it's more expensive, maybe I'd like to do this another way, and they might leave. And we could get into kind of a utility spiral downward as more people leave, prices go up, incentivizing more people to leave. This is a concern that could happen. There will be changes in business models to accommodate people's choices when they want to leave and how that affects the system. But another way that people affect their choices and show them, express them, is through the ballot box. Renewable portfolio standards, I don't think of those as an overt government policy that's actually telling people how the grid will work. They're actually policies that people are expressing how they'd like to see the grid to work, right? A sustainable political policy will be one that can survive government change. So for example, not to get political here, but Obamacare is one that probably wasn't politically sustainable. because we're seeing another party try to remove that. Now they're having difficulty, but the point I'm making is any policy that has sustainability has to have support on both sides. Renewable portfolio standards have shown that, which means that there's an underlying support for renewable energy. We see this also in things like the production tax credit that's available for wind energy or the investment tax credits that are available. That is an on and off again policy that's gone on since the 90s, but we had a bipartisan agreement to actually extend that credit through the end of 2020. It is declining to help develop renewables, to bring them to a scale where they can really be affordable. And to be honest with you, I would argue that the production tax credit is a really good example of a subsidy that did its job, and then you begin to take it away. It developed a new technology, it brought it along. But the bottom line is that created incentives in the market. So there's a little picture of the renewable portfolio standards. There are now 29 states plus DC that have them. 8 other states have voluntary standards. The majority of states in the country do. If you look at that map and you're familiar with the red and blue states, they're both. Again, this is kind of a bipartisan issue. The third big driver, cost. Renewables have declined significantly. We're here to talk about wind. This is just a picture of how much what's called the levelized cost of energy, what it costs, what a company would need to sell its energy for to cover all its costs from start to finish. So from development, construction, operation, and finally decommissioning, and eventually tear down. That whole cost, add it all up, basically divide by the number of years in operation and look at how much you would need to cover that total cost. That's levelized cost of energy. It's a metric that's used. You can see just by this figure that's been declining significantly, 66% decline. A lot of people come into things and saying the only reason wind energy works is because of a subsidy. That's absolutely not the case. People expect this to fall another 30 to 50% by the middle of the next decade. The 30% many people think is a pessimistic growth. So where are we with costs? This is a big chart, lots of pictures, but what it really is a comparative set of all the sources that we could get electricity from, what are called alternative and conventional. I would argue that wind should now be moved down into conventional if it produces going on 10% of the electricity we have today. Bottom line, you can't see all the little letters there and words and numbers. Look at the boxes. If you're further over towards where the letters are, so I have to get this right, your left. That's showing, but we're not near the top. We could be, and that might happen. That's why we're here to talk the next 2 days. So where might wind go in the future in terms of development? Where we are is in that big uptick right around 2020. That's what we're seeing. In part, this is absolutely induced by incentives. Those subsidies ended 2020. There's a rush right now to take advantage of them. It's already cheap to do wind. It's even cheaper with the subsidies. The point of those subsidies when they were installed was actually to rush development. That's what the point was. What we expect after that is, regardless of the scenario you look at, I've shown a few here, it's kind of flat for about a decade, it begins to rise again. The other rising renewable technology that will make a big difference is solar. Solar will begin to make a big difference in the 2020s. It'll compete directly against wind. So wind is not competing against the traditional sources. There's also going to be a competition among renewable sources. And that's something that will also be things that we think about and how that affects our competitiveness. So how do you enable greater renewable generation if we're thinking about the opportunity? Obviously, you need more cost reductions, you need transmission. You can take advantage of something called geographic diversification to get around this issue of intermittency. If the wind's not blowing here, it could be blowing over there. If we can make the grid adaptable enough, we can get there. The other big thing is storage. You'll often hear about that. That avoids this intermittency issue. And finally, there's just smarter use of the grid. To be honest with you, the cheapest way to provide new energy is to not use it in the first place. It's actually to use an energy efficiency measure. And in fact, if you looked at my chart, energy efficiency was on there as well as actually being lower than wind. Again, changes are happening. What are the implications? This is just a figure of the different types of price classes nationally. You saw that there was a steady growth rate in electricity rates through the 2000s. That has basically leveled off for two reasons. One is natural gas has a really depressed price. The second is the influx of now new renewables. That's probably going to continue. Another thing, positive, that a lot of people are concerned about. This is a busy figure, the ups and downs of the amount of carbon emission change from the previous year nationally in the country. What's really important to see is that little line that kind of hovers above is total carbon emissions and how they've been going up. And it looked like we just couldn't, it was we just couldn't avoid it. This constant increase, and suddenly, kind of out of the blue, our carbon emissions have begun to curve downwards. Without any major energy or climate policy in this country, we've actually affected the largest national decrease in carbon emissions, largely enabled by changes in technology and market opportunities that people have taken advantage of. So again, a couple things that people care about: price, environmental quality in one metric. So what are the challenges? Obviously there are social challenges in just how we do things. States like Wyoming are going to have a real challenge in the future dealing with these changes. We've already begun to see the change in the coal sector. If this continues the way many people think it will, we're going to have to adapt to that. Treasurer Gordon talked a little bit about that. We all have workforce development issues, right? How do you bring, again, the reason wind technicians, the fastest growing occupation in the country by far, where are they going to come from? And then obviously we have the species, cultural, social impact concerns that have to be dealt with where these renewables are deployed. These are all things that we need to deal with. If we think about Wyoming specifically, there is a list that comes out of the 20 or 25 largest wind developments that are proposed in the country. So not all of them, it's a huge list. But the top 20, if you were to just total the amount of capacity that the top 20 projects enable, this does not include things like Rocky Mountain Power and their announcement recently that they're looking for up to 1,100 megawatts of new wind. This is just specific projects like the Power Company of Wyoming's Chokecherry and Sierra Madre project or others. If you look at just Wyoming, we have 3 of the top 5 projects in the country right now in terms of size. 3 of the 5 largest. If you look at total capacity, Wyoming by far has, in the large area, the most capacity that's being proposed. Some of it is already in early construction. And this just gives you a comparison. But there are some states that we compete directly with on the grid, in particular New Mexico. And also Colorado. The wind development could happen here, but it could happen elsewhere. And so it's something we need to keep in mind. It's not guaranteed here. So the opportunity, right now, just to give you a little more perspective of what that would look like, we have right now, although you might think all of those turbines, about 1,500 megawatts, just a little less, is how we measure the capacity available. Most of that was built in a 3-year period from 2007 to 2010. And if you were here for that boom, it felt like it was just massive. You couldn't go anywhere without a blade coming down the road the other way or a tower component or something. You might have had to get out of the way if you're on a 2-lane road. Areas built up very quickly. Then it stopped. And we only built 80 megawatts after 2010. Now there's kind of a puzzle there. Was it transmission? Was it changes in tax policy? Was it something else? People just chose to build elsewhere? We're not sure. It's an active area of research. But the bottom line is, right now we have current proposals for 8,000 plus megawatts. In other words, about 5 times our current capacity. I say in the next decade that could be built. What we do know is not all of these probably will be built. But the bottom line is, even if you half that, that is significantly larger than the boom that we saw last time. So what could that do for the state of Wyoming? If we were to actually build out 8,000 megawatts, that's $13 billion in potential investment. $9 billion in new economic activity. $4 billion in new labor income, $2.5 billion in new tax revenues at a time when we're really challenged for tax revenues. Now it's over a 20-year period as they operate. It could produce significant numbers of jobs, as many as 5,600 a year in the construction phase, and as many as 2,000 a year afterwards from operations, not just at the wind farms themselves, but how those incomes create new jobs in other places, the supply sector, or in, say, hospitality, when people spend their new incomes. So there's a really large economic opportunity here at a time when the state of Wyoming really needs it. A little bit about the taxes. Dan Noble will talk a little more about this. It's been asked how much per megawatt hour in taxes wind generates. It's kind of a controversial number. The number we've come up with is about $350 if you look at all taxes. Why does that matter? To be honest with you, it doesn't. The choice really is, to me anyway, more what opportunities does wind bring to the state and what challenges are there and how we deal with them. Taxes is part of that because it's one of the ways socially we think about if there is a cost, how do we cover that cost with, say, a payment in return. Those taxes go about 1/3 locally, 2/3 to the state. So again, you can see some large numbers there that could really matter a lot to some communities that have struggled, small communities. Wind development is going to occur primarily in places where they have not had a large tax base. This is a huge shot in the arm. So what can it do for these areas? It's not just the wind turbines themselves or the construction. It's materials and construction initially, but it could end up being much larger. We could really reach and try to look for new manufacture. We could actually attract new firms coming in because we have so much renewable energy, what we call green tech sometimes. Consumers prefer renewable generation, and companies who serve them prefer renewable generation, like data centers, agriculture. There's a long list of sectors where there's a strong preference for renewable generation. If you buy your beer in Colorado, chances are if you look somewhere on the bottle or the box that your beer came in from one of those craft brewers, they'll say that they got their energy from renewable generation. But we can also talk a little bit about our competitiveness. Are there tax policies that we can implement that will make us better or make us worse? Those incentives matter. And other things that we choose to do. Is the state seen as wishing that it had renewable development here? Because if you're making a multi-billion-dollar investment in a boardroom, a conversation could go on, and people don't like to put funds at risk in a place where they perceive that people aren't happy about that development. So there are issues we need to think about. All that said, there are real challenges to wind energy. Obviously, we have cultural values that we'll want to talk about, right? The landscape, viewscapes, heritage sites that they might impact. There's species protection, environmental impacts that they have, and there are other economic impacts that aren't positive, but they're potentially negative. It could change the way we recreate within the state. It could change our attractiveness to people coming to the state in particular places, and it also might change how we access or use our lands. All important issues. So just to conclude, this energy transition is being driven by the market and technical trends. Obviously, there are some policies that drive it as well. The growth in renewables is going to continue. Whatever we choose to do, it's going to happen nationally. And there is a choice here. Wyoming could potentially benefit. All that said, we have some opportunities to make decisions, some really important ones. So when I say we have this opportunity and we're talking about the future, oftentimes people get into this predictive mode where this is the future, this is what I think will happen. What we'd really like to see is what do people want to see happen? And what we need to have is a strong and broad-based conversation about that. As I said, wind development will occur whether Wyoming participates or not. So how can we manage the wind development to our best advantage? How or can we manage the challenges that wind development creates? How do we evaluate those trade-offs to come up with some decision? It could be yes or no, but it should be more than that. If it's a yes, it's got to be a how. And so you have to have a decision-making process that's wide-ranging. And by the way, having no policy on how this will happen is a really good example of bad policy. You do need to think about how this will pan out. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my